From the heartland of America and the gateway to the West, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I'm George Norrie. This is Coast to Coast AM. Later tonight, monsters. Here's what's happening. The U.S. State Department has now confirmed the deaths of at least 22 Americans in Israel since Saturday's surprise attack by the terror group Hamas. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said that there are at least 20 Americans still missing in Israel amid the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas, which has already claimed the lives of at least 1,900 people. I asked Howard Bloom, author of The Global Brain, to check in on this very sad, tragic story. All the innocent people involved in this, Howard, it's very sad.
Well, we all think we know what happened on Saturday. Hamas fighters infiltrated Israel using a massive bulldozer to tear a hole in the smart fence draped with razor wire that separates Gaza from southern Israel. Roughly 2,000 invaders streamed through. Some of them crossed the barrier on engine-powered paragliders, some on motorcycles, some in vehicles disguised as Israeli police cars. The infiltrators then entered 22 small Israeli communities and went methodically from home to home, butchering the fathers, mothers, and children inside, in some cases raping the women, in others burning their victims alive, and yet others blowing families up with grenades. And according to one report, beheading 40 babies in just one small community, not to mention raping and killing 260 young Israelis at a peace concert. What few understood is that these barbarities are the sort of methods promoted by Muhammad himself, the founder of Islam, the man who liked to call himself a prophet of war. Muhammad said, "It is not for a prophet to take captives until he hath made great slaughter in the land." And one member of an al-Qaeda front group has said, Allah told us of the certainty of the annihilation of the infidels by means of the Muslim group, which would, in accordance with the Islamic commandment, torture them. The question now on the agenda is, how is the torture Allah wants done at our hands to be carried out? Muhammad's goal was terror. As ISIS put it, Allah has set his believers the task of terrorizing, massacring, and humiliating the enemies of Allah. ISIS adds about Islam's mass murderers, these killers are youths who divorce the world, who go on to their enemies seeking to be killed in the cause of Allah. In the invasion of Israel, 1,500 of these Hamas killers were themselves killed. Muhammad decreed that those who die killing unbelievers get an express ticket to paradise complete with 72 virgins. But Muhammad was also generous to those who lived. The 8th chapter of the Quran is about how to divide up the loot of war, including the women who become sex slaves. In the last few days, you may have seen the video of a Hamas fighter in the back of a pickup truck parading a captured Israeli woman through the streets of Gaza and putting a scarf on her head. That scarf meant he was claiming her as his sex slave. But militant Islam's savagery is not limited to Israel. Said the Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of today's Iran, Muslims have no alternative to an armed holy war against secular governments. Holy war means the conquest of all non-Muslim territories. It will be the duty of every able-bodied adult male to volunteer for this war of conquest, the final aim of which is to put Quranic law in power from one end of the earth to the other. Now remember, it's not just Hamas who is driven by Muhammad's words. It's Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, the Iranian army, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, and at least a dozen Islamist groups around the world, and Iran itself, which can build nuclear weapons within 12 days. Meanwhile, Israel has mobilized 360,000 troops to take on Hamas. And Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has called for the utter destruction of Hamas war-making capabilities. To do that, Israeli planes have bombed over 400 buildings used by Hamas. However, Hamas uses civilians as human shields. It deliberately places its military operations, its command centers, its rockets, and its ammunition in hospitals, schools, and apartment buildings. It knows that the more civilians killed by Israel's bombs, the more the world will turn on Israel. And in Hamas' eyes, there's another plus. Every Gazan civilian who dies in a war with the unbelievers is a martyr and goes directly to paradise. So for Hamas, the killing of Gaza's innocent civilians is a win-win deal.
What will Israel do now, Howard?
It's a very tricky situation. The person who planned all of this has planned it very carefully, and he knows he has provoked Israel to go into Gaza. I would imagine that Israel is that Gaza has been rigged as a kind of booby trap that will take out the entire Israeli army.
Well, I don't think that's going to happen, but it's a tragic situation all around. Wholesale price increases of U.S. goods and services jumped higher for a third consecutive month, influenced by still high energy prices. Here's investment analyst Mish Shedlock with his evaluation on what's going on. Mish, tough week. What's happening?
It's been a tough week all around, and, well, we just heard from Howard, and the bond market kind of reacted to, as I expected. Yields came down. Mortgage rates that had touched almost 8% are still down to 7.6%. That's still unaffordable. As for the PPI, about 40% of the increase for September can be traced to a rise in the price of gasoline and jet fuel. It was unexpectedly high. The Fed's not going to watch this too much, though. The minutes of the last meeting came out today. Was kind of interesting. About half of the Fed presidents were talking about the need for another rate hike. I think the war put that on ice, George. A sad way to, have the Fed go a little bit on pause here, if you would. But another thing happened is bond yields have been rising for about the past 3 weeks. A lot of people believe that rise in yield is going to take out the need for another Fed hike. A lot's just going to depend tomorrow on the CPI, George. That's the number the Fed's going to be watching far more than the PPI. And I don't have a good handle on that. I can tell you that rents have risen at least 0.4% for 25 straight months. Jeez. If rents are hot, the CPI is guaranteed to be hot. So the thing to watch for tomorrow is the price of rent, because if they jump again, the Fed's going to be trying to get in still another rate hike, despite what's going on over in Israel. And a really sad situation. Innocent people who had no part in this, George. Either side are caught up in this. That applies to both Israelis and Palestinians. Innocent people are dying at the hands of this just drives me crazy here, George, what's going on over there.
And I fear, Mish, it'll get even worse. In a moment, David Sereda joins us. Back in 1917, 3 young children saw an apparition of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Or did they? And then they say, witnesses report that the sun actually came down. Did it? David Sereda has some answers next on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you. David Sereda back with us. First aspiration in his life was to become an astronaut. And then in 1968, David and a friend witnessed a UFO along with hundreds of other witnesses. After this experience, David grew up as a UFO enthusiast, never leaving doubt of the phenomenon that has swept the world since the Roswell incident in 1947. His interest in space, religion, philosophy, astronomy, science led him on his career in related fields. He has worked deeply in high technology. He's been a regular guest on Coast to Coast for years. And as I mentioned, back in 1917 in Fatima, Portugal, 3 young children saw what they believed to be was the apparition of the Blessed Virgin Mary. What did they see? David has some answers. David, welcome back.
Good to be with you, George, tonight. Very, very auspicious. It's amazing that this all lined up because we have a eclipse that will be going through America, Central America, actually be going right through the Chichen Itza pyramid in the Yucatan on October the 14th, which is really the anniversary of the Fatima miracle, which was October 13th, 1917. Coming near to the end of World War I. So what's very special about this is that, I mean, you know, I've been at this a long time, George. I mean, from the early NASA UFO stuff, appearing with you and Art Bell. And I've spent the last 2 years on this algorithm that relies on the Fatima date and year to reveal a secret. There's two huge secrets that I'm going to reveal tonight. One is the algorithm of over 90% of the most famous UFO cases all line up every 5 years within. So all you do is you take 1917, which is the year of Fatima, and turn on your calculator and go plus 5 years, plus 5 years, plus 5 years, and you look at all these dates, right? And you have 1917, 1922, 1927, 1932 was the beginning of it's actually one of the first documented UFO crash retrievals, which was in Italy, published in Popular Mechanics. 1937 was the beginning of the Nazi Bell. It was actually a crash in 1937 that got reverse engineered and became the Nazi Bell. So then I add another 5 years to 1937. Remember, I'm starting at 1917 and I'm just adding 5 years. And that's my algorithm. And we're going to know what that 5 years means, which is going to blow everybody's mind. Then, so 5 more years, you come to the Battle of 1942 over Los Angeles, where the military fired over 1,400 rounds at these UFOs. And according to the George C. Marshall memorandums, again, they retrieved a craft, and it was taken to Muroc Field, which then became Edwards Air Force Base. Then I add 5 more years, 1947. Which is Roswell, the Maury Island, and the Ken Arnold UFO, which is massive, iconic, right? So then I add 5 more years. I'm at 1952. And the 1952 UFOs over the U.S. Capitol and the Washington Monument made Time magazine. But remarkably, most people don't know this, we're only months away from the detonation of the H-bomb in November of that same year. So we're only a few months away. So you wonder why this keeps happening. Why every 5 years, right? So when I come from 1952, 5 more years, I come to 1957, and you have the level in Texas, 200-foot-long egg-shaped UFOs, Gordon Cooper sightings. And then another 5 years, you come to Betty and Barney Hill is off by less than 1 year in my algorithm, and then another 5 years is 1967, which is Shag Harbor, right? So I don't need to go deeply into these cases. The point is to show the actual algorithm repeats every 5 years.
Now, why does it repeat every 5 years, David?
Well, we're going to get to that. Watch this, because it gets amazing. 1972, really quickly, the McCord UFO Encounter USA. 1977, 5 more years. This is a huge incident. It was the Ellsworth Air Force Base nuclear incident, Tehran Triangle UFO, and the Broadhaven, UK mass UFO Triangle, 1977. 5 more years is 1982, which is the beginning of the Hudson Valley sightings at Kent Cliffs, New York. It's a wave that began. Every single 5 years, this is going to happen. 1987, Gulf Breeze, Florida. That's 5 more years, right? Again, we're starting at Fatima in 1917.
Uncanny.
It's uncanny. Another 5 years. The South Haven Park incident, November 92, military helicopters shot down a UFO over the bay, killing 17 aliens. This is bigger than Roswell. Published in the Washington Post. And you read the article in the Post, astounding story. Right on the mark is the Phoenix Lights, 1997. So 1992 plus 5 years is 97. So how is this happening? The Phoenix Lights was a massive event. Every 5 years, George, every 5 years. The next one is Chicago O'Hare. And this one's interesting because O'Hare is November 2006. So we're almost in 2007. And Stephenville, Texas, is the first sighting is around Christmas Day 2007, where this guy has his hunting rifle and he's looking through his scope at this massive craft. But the famous date for Stephenville is January the 8th, 2008. That's 1 day from Orthodox Christmas Day, which is January the 7th, and of course, the anniversary of Tesla's death was Orthodox Christmas Day. So again, you can see a tie-in there going back to the miracle of Fatima. And then 5 more years after Chicago O'Hare and the Stephenville, right, is the end of the Mayan calendar, 2012. And guess what's next? 5 more years is a Muamua.
Dr. Avi Loeb's discovery, huh?
Right. And I read his book. Actually, even before his book came out, I did the math myself, and I decoded it, and I said, this thing's going too fast. There's no way this is a rock, like just an ordinary, traveler. And actually, if you look on the calendar, this thing was entering the orbit of Mars in early August. So if you're right on cue. See, this algorithm only deviates slightly on some of these incidences, less than half a year, but it's every 5 years. And so after 2017, we come to 2022. In 2022, I have really deep inside connections on this story because, of course, in the beginning of 2023, we heard the story of the Chinese balloons being shot down over northern Canada and Alaska. And what was really going on from eyewitness reports is this, again, began at the end of 2022, coming into 2023, when what really happened, and this is from eyewitness testimony, is that the Chinese weren't sending a balloon to spy on U.S. military bases that they already know where they exist. They were curious about these incoming craft, so they sent a spy balloon following the path so that they could get their cameras on them. And that's what we were doing as well. So the reports from the small airports up in Northwest Territories and up in the northern parts of Canada were that they were seeing craft behaving irregularly. And, of course, just like Roswell, you turned it into a balloon story, and everybody falls for it hook, line, and sinker. So the question here that is incredibly mysterious is why every 5 years? So you have to figure out.
And what's going to happen in 2027? My gosh.
Right. So 2027, and remember, it could be the end of 2027. It could be the beginning. The next thing I have to do with this algorithm is I have to perfect it right down to the day, because I know what it actually means. And the next part of this is so exciting. We have graphics. Lex has graphics up on your site at Coast to Coast AM, and there's a more mathematical article, scholarly article, PDF that's linked up there. And this next part is really, really incredible. And it gets into, we now know the military, NASA, the Air Force, every Congress's investigation into these UFOs is so open. It's never been this open, but we have to find out how they're doing it and where they're coming from, and what is. You see, I can look at all the UFO incidents, which are the big ones that line up with the algorithm, and then I can see a few that fall outside of the algorithm that are quite famous.
And David, very, very briefly, explain what an algorithm is for people who might not know.
Right. It's a repeating pattern. It's a pattern, sometimes complex. Some algorithms are complex, right? So the simple part of the algorithm, which is the repeating rhythm, is not within 5 years, every 5 years on the year, we get a major sighting. And then a deeper level of the algorithm is, what does that 5-year window correspond to in the solar system? And this gets mind-bending when we get into the next part of this, because the next part of this actually begins with a message my wife gives me. My wife died on August the 9th, 2021, which is the anniversary of Nagasaki, the bombing of Nagasaki.
Right,
and, of course, that's when Maui burned on the anniversary window of Hiroshima was the 6th of August, and Nagasaki was the 9th.
Hold on for a second, David. We're going to hit a break. We'll come back and talk about this coded message that you got from your deceased wife, Crystal, which is an amazing part of this entire story. We'll be back in a moment with David Sereda on Coast to Coast AM. His website is linked up. Take a look at some of his graphics. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with David Sereda, who will talk about the miracle of the sun at Fatima in a moment and how that ties into all of this. David, I remember the sad story of your wife, Crystal, passing away a couple of years, but apparently she's still in touch with you.
Well, it's really amazing what she's done, because my wife, Crystal Sereda, was brilliant at math, incredible attention to detail. And what I'm about to share with you, I don't know how she did this, but what she did not only decodes Fatima and the Ascension Day of Jesus Christ, but the entire solar system, including an equal and opposite number of antimatter invisible planets. So what happens, before I explain what antimatter planets are, because they're theoretically proven and possible by the early great physicists like Paul Dirac. But what she does, I'm with my kids last spring, and we're in Banff, Alberta, at a hotel, and I'm falling asleep at about 9 o'clock, and I hear my wife, crystal clear, call out my name, David. It was like a lightning bolt went through my body, George, like literally so loud it jolted me out of bed. And I don't even know how I knew how to do this, but I said, how many days has it been since Crystal died? And if you go to the graphic on my section for tonight at Coast to Coast AM, and you pull up the graphic, and it says 591 and phi 1.618 decodes the solar system. So the first thing I noticed is it was 591 days after she died. And for those Richard Hoagland fans out there, Richard and I have been doing shows together. 591 is 19.5 in reverse, and the reverse part of it is really part of the great secret, because basically half of our solar system is invisible and the other half is visible. It's kind of like a card dealer playing cards in Vegas, and he's hiding his best cards, and you don't know what they are. So it's 591 days after she died, August 9th, is 1.618 years after she died, which is the golden ratio. And, of course, the golden ratio, for those of you who don't know, it's when you see the spiral of the Milky Way, the arms of the Milky Way galaxy, and the spirals and seashells and snails and ferns and plants, that spiral is decoded by the ratio of 1 to 1.618. 0.339.887 to be exact. So what I do, George, is I take the number, and anybody can do this. You get your calculator, and you put in this magic number, 591, divided by 1.618, 0.339.887, and the entire solar system is decoded. The first number you get is the exact number of days per year on Earth, which is 365.258.087, all your decimals. Perfect.
Is that bizarre? How can that be?
How could that be? Right? So I divide it by the golden ratio again, and I get Venus exactly. It's exact. How did my wife do this?
And this isn't a fluke. It's real.
This is not a fluke, because then I do it again after Venus, and I get a planet with an orbit of 139.51 days. And guess what? When the miracle, at Fatima, the first date that the Mother Mary appears to the children is May the 13th. That's 139 days from Christmas.
Of 1917.
Of the previous Christmas. So it's 139 days into the year. You can start your new year on the solar year, which would be Christmas. You could start at January 1st, give or take. Because the sidereal time clock changes slightly every year. Just like this year, we're having this annular ring eclipse go right through us on the anniversary of Fatima by 1 day difference. And that 1 day means nothing, considering it's been 106 years. And even though every 4 years we adjust for the leap year, which we're doing in February, by the way. So what I'm saying is it's so perfect that I found this point between Venus and Mercury of 139 days, because the first day she appears to the children, it's 139 days into the year 1917. And the miracle of the sun is the 139.51 day orbit times 2 perfectly. I mean, 98% accuracy.
And David, explain what the miracle of the sun is for some people.
Well, so the miracle of the sun, and I'm going to explain what really caused it here in a minute, is about 60,000 people gathered on the hill in Fatima, Portugal, 1917. This is, I think, just before the great influenza and near the end of World War II, because the World War II ends in 1918.
No, World War I.
World War I, sorry, World War I. You're right. You're right. It's World War I. So what's amazing about this epoch in history now is look what's happening now, and we're having an eclipse on the anniversary window of Fatima this Saturday. Get ready if you live in the western United States at about 8:30 in the morning for it to start winding up. And so the other thing that lines up to this 139.51 day orbit is Jesus' Ascension Day. And his Ascension Day is from the moment he resurrects after the 3 days of after the crucifixion and 3 days he resurrects. 40 days later, he ascends physically into the heavens. Right now, it turns out, of course, that day oscillates just a little bit each year. It's nearly exactly this past year 139 days into the year. Okay, so how could this number? I had to really think about it for a long time. Could there be a planet there that we don't know about, or could there be an antimatter planet there that we don't know about? So watch what happens.
And again, back to the miracle of the sun, because you need to finish up on that.
I don't know. We're going to get there. So thanks for reminding me, because I'm going to fulfill that. Watch how I'm going to fulfill that, because I divided by the golden ratio again, and I get Mercury's orbit 98% accurate. And then watch this. You're going to love this. I do it 2 more times, and I arrive within the orbit of planet Vulcan. So everybody knows Spock in Star Wars is from planet Vulcan. But planet Vulcan, I'm going to come back to Fatima in a second. You'll see how I do this. Planet Vulcan was an elusive planet. Early French astronomers in the 18th century and coming into the 19th century, they could see planet Vulcan. They could see that it wasn't a sunspot, and then it would disappear. And then they would say, maybe we didn't see it. And then they would see it again, and it's not a sunspot. And then it vanishes. So how does a whole planet become visible and then invisible? Now, I'll come to Fatima because that's the big one here on the 139.51 and what caused the sun to what apparently strobe with amazing light to the witnesses of over 60,000 people on the hill.
And David, this has fascinated me since I was a kid, by the way, so I'm looking forward to your explanation.
Yeah, and I have a highly detailed article on your site. It's a PDF for the people who are good at math and want to really go through the long 18 pages. You're going to really get this. So watch what happens. When you come back to the early days, and of course I used to work for a legendary nuclear physicist, Bogdan Castle-Maglich, who was contemporary of Louis Alvarez at Berkeley, and he's one of the discoverers of a subatomic particle called the Omega Mason. So I studied particle physics. In fact, I'm going to actually read you something very quick here. It says, it is certainly possible that there are antimatter galaxies with antimatter solar system planets and anti-people. In Dirac's theory, we might say that the anti-people are holes in it. So what I'm saying is, see, this gets really deep. And this is in a lost Christian manuscript called the Apocryphon of John, which is known as the Secret Gospel of John, found at Nag Hammadi, Egypt in 1945. And in this manuscript, Jesus, in this resurrection period of the 40-day window before his ascension of the 139-day mark into the year, he tells John the same story that Zechariah Sitchin told all of us, that our bodies were engineered by a team of gods and goddesses physically, and that we weren't made by one God. But Jesus tells John something completely unique to Zechariah Sitchin's interpretation of these ancient Sumerian manuscripts. And that is that when we were made kind of to be slaves to a king demigod leader, And in the Gnostic literature, his name is Yaldabaoth. He's kind of like a Zeus type of character, an egotistical, obnoxious god. And Jesus tells John, the supreme God above him planted a luminous seed called an epinoia in every single human being that allowed us to surpass the intelligence and the enlightenment of those who physically created us. And then the chief god, the Zeus-type god, got jealous and cast all humans to the lowest region of matter, not a geographical region, a region coded on matter itself. So all the electrons in our bodies are spinning negative. They're called electrons. And when the positron, which is the positive electron, was discovered, and Dirac is one of the two earliest physicists, Paul Dirac, who were the discoverers who confirmed antimatter, meaning the positron, positive electron.
And that was back in 1928, wasn't it?
Right. There's several experiments that were done in these cloud chambers that more and more they had confirmation. And then they had to try and make, you're not going to believe where the antimatter is in our world, but I'll get to that in a minute. They tried to make a hydrogen atom. Remember, we're mainly water. We're 87% water, which is 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen, right? So they had to make an anti-hydrogen atom, and they did. And when they made the hydrogen atom, the anti-hydrogen atom, which means the electrons are spinning the other way, positive instead of negative, and all the subatomic particles spinning opposite to their original positions. They realized there could be anti-people and anti-planets in our solar system and anti-galaxies, and that black holes could be the portal to go to the other side of the mirror, right? So remember when my wife gave me the number 591, which decodes the whole solar system, because you can take that number and you can multiply it by the golden ratio, and you'll hit actually the dwarf planets in the asteroid belt series. You'll hit the orbit of Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. You'll hit all of them. That number decodes everything, and its mirror inverse is 19.5, which of course is legendary with Richard Holgan's work. So watch what happens here now. Once you get this in your mind, that they've known this forever, that there could be anti-people and anti-planets. When you take the formula, going back to the graphic, if I take 591 divided by the golden ratio, I get Earth, exactly, the number of days that it takes Earth to go around the sun. Then I get Venus, and then I get what I'm going to call the ascension planet of Jesus that lines up with Fatima. And then I get Mercury, and then 2 more times I get planet Vulcan, which is, you can read about planet Vulcan, by the way, on Wikipedia. Now, when I go the other way, I'll come to 3 dwarf planets in the asteroid belt, then I'll come to Jupiter, and then I'll come to a planet between Jupiter and Saturn, then I'll come to Saturn, and then I'll come to one between Saturn and Uranus and Neptune.
Let me ask you this, though, David. I got to ask you this. Was the miracle of the sun at Fatima the sun coming down, the illusion of the sun, or was it a UFO?
Okay, what happens? Because I thought it must have been a UFO in the beginning. For years, I thought it must have been a UFO that lined up. Just like when Jesus was crucified and there was 3 hours of darkness, that couldn't be a solar eclipse because you can't get 3 hours of darkness in an eclipse. You're lucky to get a couple of minutes. So what happens when it turns out that there is antimatter on our planet all the time, and a teaspoon, a tiny, tiny, tiny amount of antimatter would produce a nuclear explosion as big as Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which is about 22 kilotons. A tiny amount of antimatter. Now, when the anti-planets, these hypothetical anti-planets, which are mathematical and perfect golden ratio to the number 591, to a high degree of accuracy, better than 95 to 98%, then if the miracle planet, the ascension planet that lines up with Jesus' ascension and the 2 dates of Fatima, what that means is that planet might have oscillated and the equilibrium of its antimatter to matter shifted. And when that happens, there's a huge flash of light. an enormous flash of light called gamma, a gamma burst. And that gamma burst is the annihilation of matter with antimatter, and then that annihilation converts it into a huge flash of light that then sends it back to the other side of the mirror. Now, that would mean possibly even the Star of Bethlehem is this when this alignment occurs. And this alignment occurs every year, give or take, because it's slightly different each year. The ascension of Jesus is some years it's 139 days, and some years it's a little less than that, and some years just a little bit more than that. And that's your tolerance, which is in the golden ratio itself. So what I'm saying is, based on the decoding of the solar system's antimatter planets that Dirac and all the great physicists knew, I believe somebody way up their nose. And guess this is, now we're going to go back to our UFO algorithm in a minute here too, because we're going to see how this connects to the every 5 years. I believe what's happened is the planet heavens are these equal and opposite. Remember, Newton's law says every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So every planet is an action. So every planet has to have an equal and opposite reaction. But when you, and this is really amazing, George, because only recently in the past month, Nature published a story, and I believe this is in response to the investigation of UFOs, that antimatter, and they wanted to know this, does it get attracted by the gravitational pull of the sun and the earth? And the answer is yes, it does, which would mean an antimatter planet could orbit around the sun, be maintained by its gravity in these perfect golden ratio periods of days that they take to go around the sun, and exist, but we don't see it except for periodically when the equilibrium of matter to antimatter oscillates such that it could happen. Now, guess where all the antimatter is? Lightning strikes. It turns out we have satellites monitoring, and this really gets fascinating, because you see all these lightning strikes in the Bible. They're all over the place, with the arrival of God, with the arrival of the ascended Jesus, with the destruction of when the temple.
So you're saying there's a science behind this. David, we're going to take a break. We'll come back and chat more and take some phone calls with you as well, and then get into exactly how you figured all this stuff out. Back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM.